So today we're going to talk about essay writing. In particular, we're going to focus on exam essay writing, which is timed essay writing. In the Cambridge IGCSE, you have just 45 minutes on average per essay, which means that really strategy is going to be very important. We're going to talk today firstly about the introduction. We'll then look at body paragraphs and point evidence explanation, and finally we'll look at how to write a good conclusion. So first of all, the introduction. Now the introduction is important because it's obviously the first thing the examiner is going to read, and it gives your essay direction and structure. I would suggest that in a 45-minute essay you look to just have a one-sentence introduction. So one sentence and then move on to your first body paragraph. It's important, if you do this, that sentence contains a thesis. A thesis, of course, is the answer to the question. So your whole essay is looking to prove one point, and that point is your thesis. So let's have a look at what this means. We'll look at a question, and we'll have a look at a bad thesis and a good thesis. So a question that could well come up in the exam is on Report to Wordsworth here, on Cheng's poem, and it says, explore how the poet powerfully conveys mankind's destruction of nature. I've highlighted the word how because I think that's the most important word in this question. That's what we're looking to show. What techniques does he use to powerfully convey this theme? So a bad thesis statement merely rewords the question. Report to Wordsworth powerfully conveys mankind's destruction of nature. It does not in any way answer this little word here, how. A good example, however, as we have just here, yes, rewords the question, but it also then critically uses this word through and gives us three things that the essay is going to talk about. We have imagery, allusion, and rhythm. Okay, so it's quite clear from this thesis statement that my essay will probably have three paragraphs: one on imagery, one on allusion, and one on how he breaks up the rhythm. And all of these are used to powerfully convey mankind's destruction of nature. So let's have a look at a body paragraph. This is where peeing is important. As we know, peeing is in our nature. Point, evidence, explanation. So first of all, this is a common mistake that pupils make. The quotation's clear because it has these quotation marks, so this must be our evidence. And what we quite commonly get is something like this. Now this should be the point just here, but it just says in the quote, and in the quote is not a point. You can't start a paragraph or a point or opinion in this fashion. So let's have a look at the good example. Here we have a point, which is that he tells us how we're slowly choking the planet with his powerful statement, smothered by the smog, which is the evidence. You'll notice the point is pretty obvious, it's quite basic, and this is now why the explanation or development becomes so important. What you'll see in the explanation is that first of all I explain how this is emphasised by the punctuation either side of it, which makes us pause, makes us stop and think. Secondly, I focus on the particular word smothered, which for me is powerful because smothering is something that we use to describe a murderer or a type of murder. We don't really use it in many other situations. So it basically characterises mankind as being a murderer, and that for me is far more powerful than just saying that we're polluting. To say we're murdering carries further moral implications. I comment on the sound. Sibilance here is the repetition of an S sound, and how that perhaps creates a sense of emptiness. The emptiness obviously that will be left after nature has been destroyed. And finally I just sort of give a final sentence here to the paragraph, tying up the three ideas and going back to my thesis, which was how he uses imagery to powerfully portray mankind's destruction of nature. We have an emptiness our insatiable actions are causing. We're killers, and like a murderer who smothers, are able to look at our victim as we kill them. So that's an example of a good body paragraph. A PEE, quite clear the point, the explanation, and then this bit here that develops the idea and shows why it's particularly powerful, which was, of course, the question. And that would be easily an A star answer. So let's move on to conclusions. Conclusions are difficult to write if you haven't written the whole essay. So I'm going to try and give you a strategy to go about how to write a good conclusion, and hopefully it will serve you well in your exam. So first of all, a conclusion should be quite easy if you have a good thesis in your introduction. Okay. Why do I say that? Well, because I would always start my conclusion by restating the thesis. You start your essay with a thesis that answers the question. You then have 2 or 3 body paragraphs which prove that, and then you have your conclusion which restates the thesis. However, if you just simply copy it word for word, it's quite simplistic. What you need to do is to try to paraphrase it, to rewrite it. So, looking at the example, we can see quite clearly how it's been reworded. Let's just remind ourselves of the key points of the original introduction, where that we're going to talk about imagery, illusion, and rhythm. In conclusion, Cheng's constant reference to words that evoke murder and murderers. Okay, well, that's his imagery, isn't it? The inability of mythical gods to help us, that's his illusion, and the constant interruption of the poem's rhythm through caesura, which is the technical term for that, and obviously that's the rhythm, all combine to make this poem powerfully anti-man's actions towards nature. So what I've tried to do here is not just summarise, but I've synthesised. I've shown how I'm saying they all combine. So they all work together to make it more powerful. Nevertheless, I would say this is still not an A-star conclusion. What it's missing is a final sentence to really kind of persuade the examiner that I've engaged with the poem, that I've enjoyed the poem, and that I've understood it. So on this page we're going to have a look at how you can do that final sentence. 2 ideas that I often work with are thinking about either a greater significance or a modern significance of the work. So let's just put those in green because it's a bit easier to see. So I've written this sentence here. As well as this, his rejection of the gods' powers and references to things like the ozone layer and global warming make this an example of poetry for the modern reader. So I'm referring to why it's particularly poignant or important to me, what he says in this poem, and in that sense I'm referring to the modern significance of the poem. This is a nice tactic because what it does is it makes the examiner think that not only have you studied this poem, but you've enjoyed the poem, and if he thinks you've enjoyed the poem, then he's obviously going to be more persuaded that you're an A-star pupil. As to enjoy it, you have to understand it. So let's have a look at the whole conclusion now. In conclusion, Cheng's constant reference to words that evoke murder and murderers, the inability of mythical gods to help us, and the constant interruption of the poem's rhythm through caesura all combine to make this poem powerfully anti-man's actions towards nature. As well as this, his rejection of the gods' powers and references to things like the ozone layer and global warming make this an example of poetry for the modern reader. Okay, so very simple tips, but hopefully they will help you with regards to writing a much stronger essay and a much more focused essay. So in summary, we obviously begin with the introduction. Introduction should be just 1 sentence and must be a thesis. It's got to answer the question. Then, in our body, make sure that we P, E, and E. So that means we have a good point, followed by a quotation, and then where we earn most of our marks here in the explanation or development, which should obviously relate to our thesis. Finally, after 2 or 3 body paragraphs, we come to our conclusion, where we look to restate the thesis and finish with 1 final statement that makes the examiner think, hey, I'm not just an A pupil, but I am an A-star pupil. Thank you very much. This has been a tutorial on essay writing.